Yeah, good evening to you all and welcome. We have a real treat tonight to welcome back Dr. Janet Nolan for the third time as a guest presenter at the Michael Crowley Lecture Series to close out this first part of the 2021 series. And I'm Mike Slane. I head up a board of very talented people that bring you so many venues, and this has been the prime one, as you all know, for the past year during COVID. I wanted to mention that Janet recently relocated after spending about 10 years in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, to her childhood home where she's writing the next book, and which is the topic of tonight's lecture. She writes about her grandparents, Harry and Mary Ann Nolan, who I think I'm not going to recite her bio, but I think one great little nugget out of there is the fact that they met at an Ancient Order of Hibernian dance in Lynn in the 1890s. I think that's just phenomenal, and it kind of sets the stage for what's going to follow with Janet. Before I call on Dr. Nolan, a few general announcements. We do plan to reopen this fall with hopefully in-person lectures and events. I can't forecast, obviously, at this time, whether it's going to be limited or unlimited seating. Time will tell. But we do have on the on-deck circle in September timeframe, Dr. John Quinn and Keith Stokes to discuss the role of the Irish and the Black collaboration during the Gilded Age here in Newport, as well as another presentation on Irish immigrants in the domestic service. During the summer, we hope by that time that we'll be able to reopen the Interpretive Center. And at the present time, Steve Marino is surveying the docents to ascertain their comfort level with, first of all, serving as docents and then meeting the general public at the Interpretive Center. And we're looking at other events during the summer to maintain your interest. But I'll mention here now that the Interpretive Center is open by appointment. So if any of you in the audience have family members, out-of-town visitors that would like to visit the Interpretive Center, our numbers are both at the center and on the website. So take a look there, dial us up, and we'll be glad to come down and arrange an in-person meeting for a limited number of people. Now, for our non-members, if you have enjoyed the Crowley Lecture Series, please consider going online and joining our membership. These events have all been free to you, but there is a cost to us to produce and execute these. So go to newportirishhistory.org and join our family. Now to Dr. Janet Nolan. This is her third visit to us, and we're indebted to her. In 2014, her presentation was entitled Servants of the Poor, and it addressed teachers and their mobility, both in Ireland and American Irish at the turn of the century. In 2017, she presented a most interesting presentation on weathering the storm. A lot of folks in the audience didn't realize that the Irish were, in fact, deep sea fishermen, and she brought to us the story of Irish deep sea fishermen who had relocated to Gloucester, Mass. She was educated at the University of Massachusetts. She earned her MA in history from University of Rhode Island and her doctorate degree in history from the University of Connecticut. She served as a professor at Loyola University, Chicago for more than a quarter of a century, and she is now a professor emerita of Loyola University. She is a noted author, pioneering scholar in the role of women in Irish immigration history, and her achievements go far beyond her bio, and she's too modest to mention these, so I'm going to mention two. During a 9-year span, Janet was named one of the 3 most effective teachers at Loyola University, Chicago. She was also named one of the faculty members who most inspired her students to become historians. She intimated that this may be her last formal presentation, but I learned tonight that that may not be the case. And to thank her for all of her contributions to the museum, which also included the donation of nearly 100 books from her personal library. And to keep her in our family, we have enrolled her with a lifetime membership in the Museum of Newport Irish History. So you may now ignore those annual renewal letters, Janet. Please join me in giving her a warm Newport welcome to Dr. Janet Nolan, and give a little round of applause there. And I'll just mention to the audience one last thing. If you have Q&As and you know how to use the chat room at the bottom of the screen, please use the chat. If not, we'll catch you afterwards. Raise your hand and we'll point out and let you address your questions in that manner. Dr. Janet Nolan.
And someone else is speaking. You're seeing in front of you a map of Ireland in the small corner there in the upper left, and you can see a dark green county outlined at the bottom in the extreme southwest. And that is, as probably most of you know, County Cork. We're going to be very interested for the first part of my talk tonight with Skibbereen, which is down in the extreme left edge there. You see Derry Connell and Skibbereen. Skibbereen means little boat harbor, and it wasn't founded until the 17th century as a town, but it's been a thriving farm trading town ever since. And if you go there today, it's a wonderful town to visit. If you go up towards the east, northeast here, you'll see Bandon with a little orange dot over the B, and that's going to figure into our story tonight too. And then they don't have the city of Cork on this map, but if you go to the east of Bandon, you'll see Cove, C-O-B-H, and it's pronounced Cove in Irish. And Cork City is probably just exactly where the orange dot to the left of Cove is. And Cove is right on the sea, as you can see. It's a very short trip from the city of Cork to Cove, as many of you know. So that's the geography of Harry and Mary Ann. And I want to tell you the story of Harry and Mary Ann, and I'm going to start now. And we will find out how they met. In early April of 1888, 16-year-old Mary Ann Donovan stood alone on the quays of Queenstown. Cove, by the way, is the English had named it Queenstown. And of course, after Ireland got its independence, they gave it its original name, Cove. But they called the quays of Queenstown when Mary Ann was there in 1888, waiting to board a ship bound for Boston in far-off America. Her parents, Mary Coughlin and John Donovan, had died a year before, and her older sister Ellen, or Nellie, had already gone to America, making Mary Ann and her brother John the only members of the family still in Skibbereen. Their cottage, with its Dutch door, was at a crossroads, and graves dotted the farm's yard. Mary Ann's grandmother on her mother's side had been a Martin, people of means, which may be the reason the family had survived the famine of the late 1840s, when Skibbereen saw at least 10,000 buried in a mass grave on the outskirts of town. By the way, there are two mass graves, huge ones in Skibbereen, that you can go visit. The Donovan parents, however, were laid to rest much later in the Martin family's graveyard. By that time, Nellie was working as a domestic in Lynn, Massachusetts. Her letters home were the bright spots in the Donovan household and were eagerly read when the man with the letters from Bandon, and you see Bandon here on the screen, made his weekly trip to town. The Donovans were an ancient clan in Skibbereen, and extended family ties were close and long-lasting. In the century since the 1100s, however, when Strongbow began the generations-long fight to subjugate the hereditary Irish chiefs to English rule, the Donovans had ended up as tenants to the Swanton family on what had once been their ancestral lands. This usurpation rankled. Once, Mary Ann's father, John, showed his anger at the brothers, Masters George and Robert Swanton, when they rode roughshod through its fields. Years later, and on a new continent, Mary Ann's daughter Helen remembered her mother telling her that Master Robert, the younger of the two, was very nice, but Master George was the one who had my father arrested when he shook his fist at George and his friends who chased the fox through father's garden. The arrogance of the Sassenach was not forgotten among the Donovans, even in America. Mary Ann looked about her. From where she stood, she could read the name SS Marathon in foot-high letters that stretched across the bow of the vessel that would be her home as she crossed the water. It had been a 2-day trip from Skibbereen to Queenstown in the ship, and you can see it's about 49 miles. I looked it up just the other day, between Skibbereen and the city of Cork. But they must have stopped, they were in a cart with a horse, and they must have stopped in Bandon overnight and then went on to Cork and Cove, I'm guessing, for the 2 days there. Brother John had driven her by cart to Bandon, and from there she boarded a train to Cork City and then on to the port. John stayed behind. He planned to sell the family farm, and then he too would join his sisters. As the restraining ropes were lowered, the crowd on the dock surged forward, pushing Mary Ann, along with thousands of other girls like her, to new lives in a new world. This was to be the last voyage of the marathon. The trip had been, quote, a very long, difficult one because of a severe storm it encountered, Mary Ann later told her daughter Helen, who adds, it lasted 11 days, I think. After such a troubled crossing, the ship broke down in a northeast gale, 1 day's journey out of Boston Harbor. Towed to the city, never to sail again, the marathon had carried Mary Ann to America nonetheless. As an unmarried girl, Mary Ann Donovan landed in America alone, but she was welcomed in her new home by an extended family already there. In fact, Mary Ann seemed to have had at least as many relatives in Massachusetts as were left in Skibbereen. A photo of Nellie. At the time of her arrival, Sister Nellie was a live-in maid in one of Lynn's elegant houses along the exclusive oceanfront area of the city. So her teenage sister was first sent to relatives in North Brookfield, a town west of Worcester, Massachusetts. Relatives named the McCullochs lived there, her daughter Helen wrote, and also among them was her distant cousin, Cornelius Connie Mack. 10 years older than Mary Ann, cousin Connie had been born in 1862. His father, Michael McGilligutty, an immigrant from famine-era Ireland, had settled in the town to work in its cotton mill and changed the family name to Mack because it sounded less Irish in those no Irish need apply years. Connie escaped his father's fate, however, by showing early promise playing the new game of baseball. He eventually became the nationally famous manager of the Philadelphia Athletics and was elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1938. Mary Ann remained proud of her famous relative and followed his career until his death at age 93 in 1956. Other North Brookfield connections lasted through her life as well. I remember we used to visit a Frances Fleming in Worcester in later years, and Marie McAuliffe, another relative of my mother's, also lived in North Brookfield. Mary Ann's son, Bill, writes, I remember Marie as a stunning woman who visited Mary Ann frequently in later years. My sister Helen says that Marie was supposed to bear a strong resemblance to my mother when my mother was younger. I don't know how long Mother stayed in North Brookfield, Bill continues, but like Connie Mack, Mary Ann also didn't remain there long. Helen reports that after a short stay out west, she went to Lynn to stay with Aunt Nellie, who by this time had married another immigrant from Ireland, Thomas Williams. Nellie was living in the western part of the city, Bill tells us. Ellen B. Williams, or Aunt Nellie as we called her, was 10 years older than my mother and greatly resembled her. By this time, Brother John had also settled in Lynn, probably because the oldest family member had settled there. By this time, Bill continues, John had inherited their father's land and buildings in Skibbereen and came to America after he settled the estate there. Uncle John was 7 years older than my mother, Bill tells us. Nellie's great-granddaughter, Mary Campbell, recalled that the Williams family lived around the corner from Aunt Mary Ann's, on the first floor of a 3-decker house bought by the proceeds from the sale of the Donovan farm back in Skibbereen. An Italian family rented the second floor. Brother John and his family lived over them on the third floor. The 3-decker is this pale yellow house on the right side of the picture. The White House, the 2.5-story White House next to it, eventually was also purchased by John. So he had quite a little real estate empire going on here in West Lynn. As I recall, Bill tells us, Aunt Nellie's family was a happy, merry one. Our Williams cousins were older by several years than corresponding members of the Nolan family. The Williams clan consisted of Aunt Nellie and Uncle Tom, Lena, John, Hugh, Mamie, and Cornelius. Connie and my older brother Joe were friends for many years until Connie's death in the early 1970s. Helen states, Bill tells us, that Uncle Tom Williams lived on Blarney Lane in Cork before emigrating. A fitting address, she notes, for such an eloquent storyteller. The John Donovans were a comparatively small family, consisting of my mother's brother John and his wife Kate, and 3 children, May, John, who was born in 1911, a year before I was, says Bill, almost to the day, and a younger sister, Margaret. The Donovans were far more prosperous than the Nolans or the Williamses. Uncle John owned some real estate by the time I arrived on the scene in 1912. And his son, John Jr., received a brand new Graham Page car as a high school graduation gift, an unheard of thing in those days. May eventually became a nun, and John Jr. retired as the deputy superintendent of schools in Lynn in 1977. Margaret worked at the General Electric, like all good Lynners. If you look at this picture, if you were there in person, the Boston skyline, which is very faint on the far horizon there to the south, is much clearer. It's not that far at all, but you can see from Lynn's shorefront, you can see, of course, Boston. Lynn was a bustling industrial city along the coast 10 miles north of Boston. When she arrived in the city, Mary Ann found a job as a laundress in Mr. Spinney's laundry. She had learned to do fancy pressing at a national school in Ireland. She loved to iron clothes, Helen tells us, and she was very proud of it. She was the one who ironed the fancy shirts. Evidently, that was a prized job in the establishment. Mary Ann carried more than ironing skill with her from her school days in Ireland. She had also been a pupil monitor, another highly prized position, tutoring the younger students, and her education stayed with her for the rest of her life. You know how she loved poetry, Helen once wrote Brother Bill. She used to read it to us and recite all the time. There was a page in the Sunday Boston Globe for poetry. I still have some clippings that she cut out to save. She loved mystery stories too. She used to buy paperbacks all the time, Helen remembers. She always guessed the villain. I used to suspect that she sometimes read the end first. Mary Ann also knew a few songs in Gaelic and a few expressions. Of course, Gaelic was forbidden to be spoken when she was a child in the 1870s and 1880s. She was always interested in Ireland and the Irish. She read the Irish World. She loved the Notre Dame football team, even listened to the games on the radio. Her son Harry bought her a Notre Dame pennant. St. Patrick's Day was a very special day to all of us too, because it was her birthday, Helen continues. I think she, like other immigrants, kept alive the spirit and love of Ireland and instilled it in her children. I know, Helen claimed, I'm more Irish than the Irish. I love to get a ticket for the Irish sweepstakes. Bill adds, she never talked much to me of her days in Ireland, but her love of the Isle was very evident. He did remember her using a Gaelic word fairly often, however, Amadon, you fool, whenever her children exasperated her good nature. Mary Ann was fond of telling her daughter Helen stories about growing up in Ireland. One story, which she sincerely believed, involved a hill or a mountain or at least a big rock, Helen writes. Brother John was stricken with some illness that left him lame. so much so that he had to walk with a hacksaw stick. He made a visit to this rock. A loud wailing was heard, and suddenly John came back running, cured for life. In addition to Celtic superstitions, Mary Ann was also a devout Catholic. The rosary was recited each night following the evening meal, a practice she carried on all her life, Helen tells us. Towards the end of her life, an infant of Prague statue, with its silk robes changed according to the ecclesiastical calendar, adorned the top of a television set in her elegant Swampscott home. Like many Irish of her generation, Mary Ann's sincere religious beliefs were buttressed by religious symbolism that graced everyday life. On September 26, 1897, in Lynn, Mary Ann Donovan married Harry James Nolan. Recorded as a year apart in age on their marriage certificate, they are listed as a 25-year-old laundress and a 24-year-old Morocco dresser, both from Ireland. Harry's work as a Morocco dresser was a common one for Irish immigrants in Lynn, the largest shoe manufacturer in Massachusetts at the time. In fact, Irish newcomers like Harry dominated this dangerous work involving toxins, which created the delicate leathers for fancy women's shoes. And there's Mary Ann, and there's Harry. Although the registration of births in post-famine Ireland was haphazard and no actual record of their births has yet been found, my mother and father were about the same age, their son Bill writes. And in fact, their marriage certificate indicates that they were born less than a year apart. Mary Ann on March 17, 1872, and Harry on February 21st, 1873. My father was born on Fair Lane in County Cork, Ireland, Bill adds, and my mother in Skibbereen, County Cork, Ireland. And here's their marriage certificate. You can see Morocco dresser and the ages, laundress, Lynn, Mass, September 26, 1897. Okay, this is a duplicate done by the city of Lynn in 1940 something. So the original is in, I think, was in my Aunt Helen's possession until she died. Where it is now, I don't know, but happily we do have this copy. Harry and his mother, Catherine O'Connor Nolan, probably docked in Boston, and again, we don't really know, in the year 1875, 10 years prior to my mother's arrival, Bill continues. They came to Lynn probably because Catherine had relatives here. Harry was only 2 years old at the time, and his mother was a widow of James Nolan. His aunt, Mary O'Connor, lived in Lynn with her 3 children, Michael, Patrick, and Maine. Catherine died in 1904, and she is buried with her brothers in the O'Connor lot in St. Joseph's Cemetery in Lynn, Bill writes. You can see this gravestone. You see the next to the last name at the bottom, 1855 to 1904, which would have made her about 49 years old when she died, Catherine Nolan, Catherine O'Connor Nolan. And then you see Patrick O'Connor up at the top and Michael O'Connor, and then their wives who outlive her by many decades. I can remember the O'Connors when they lived on Fuller Street in Lynn, Bill continues. Although by no means could this address be considered fashionable, the O'Connors had wealth, not just money, wealth. I knew they were prosperous because they had motor cars at a time when no one else in West Lynn seemed to have them. This must have been before 1917 because cars were more commonplace after the First World War, although I don't think Graham Page's cars were commonplace at all, even in the early 1930s when Bill's cousin had his own. The O'Connors later moved to a better neighborhood, Bill continues, eventually moving to Lynn's almost suburban Ward 1 near Wyoma Square. This address later became a funeral home and therefore must have been posh in its O'Connor's heyday, Bill writes. Cousin Pat O'Connor lived in Nahant and, from what I could gather, was a source of worry and concern for his older brother, Mike. But I liked him. He was always laughing, and I think my mother preferred him to the steadier, more affluent Mike. That was my godfather and John's wife, John Donovan's wife, Aunt Kate Donovan, my godmother. But Mike O'Connor and someone named Marcella had been the best man and bridesmaid at my parents' wedding. Pat's older brother, Mike O'Connor, lived nearby in densely Irish West Lynn before moving up and out when Bill was growing up. Mike, like John Donovan, was comparatively well off. In Mike's case, because some of his income came from running Lynn's numbers game. He collected and counting the betting slips for that very popular lottery based on guessing the US Treasury's daily balance before it was published in the evening newspaper. Uncle Mike, as he was known, spread his largesse around. Bill and his siblings gathered at the family's round oak dining table when he appeared. They counted the receipts and helped Mike tally the proceeds, and each received a bit of the profit for themselves. Money was scarce in the Nolan household, and Uncle Mike was a roguish Santa Claus, and never to be forgotten by his nieces and nephews, including Bill. Other cousins of Harry Nolan were also part of Irish West Lynn. According to Bill, among them were the Cretons, pronounced Crichton, Walter Sr. and his children Mary, Angela, Walter Jr., and Ambrose. Also living nearby, adds Helen, were relatives of Pa's, Frank and Andy O'Keefe. Their mother and Pa's mother and Aunt Mary were all sisters. I think you're beginning to see there's a network here. These people are not strangers in the strange new land. Families were more closely knit in former times, Bill writes, probably because of the economic situation and being strangers in the land. Nobody thought of leaving home until he was married. My brother John, born in 1898, was the first to leave our house when he married Marge Craig of Dorchester in 1928. He was 30 years old at the time. By the way, all his younger siblings, including my father, Bill, just loved Uncle Johnny, their brother, Johnny. And this is a picture, I think, at his confirmation. He was a very religious man, and I love his confirmation name there. And he was also, as we'll see, a scholar. So I think that's a charming picture of a young man on his way up. Sibling rivalry seems to have crossed the ocean as well, as Helen reports. Uncle Johnny Donovan inherited all their parents' possessions, many of which he brought to this country. Since he first went to live with Nellie, she was the recipient. Ma never even got a dish. Nevertheless, Ma was evidently the apple of her father's eye. He called her Little Mary and protected her from the more aggressive Nell, Helen tells us. Despite missing out on some of the family's treasures, Mary Ann's busy life included much social activity in various civic and club groups, son Bill tells us. She and her sister Ellen, Nellie, organized social affairs among their Lynn associates, quite apart from their civic and fraternal responsibilities. These groups, just for fun, endured into Mary Ann's life, and one of them was named for her sister Ellen, who died in the early 1940s. Mary Ann also loved to play whist, Helen remembers. I used to play with her every night, no matter what time I got home, until she could no longer see the cards towards the end of her life. My sister Kathleen even brought her a deck that had orange, green, and black suits to help her distinguish among them. Housewarming parties were held whenever a member of the Irish community succeeded in moving into a new home, a signal that he would pay rent no longer. A throwback perhaps to the hated rent gouging in the old country. But now he would have his own house on his own land, Bill continues. We rented 40 Spencer Street when I was a child, occupying the second and third floors of this 3-story house, where the boys slept upstairs 3 to a room and the girls slept in the dining room. But in December 1924, my father bought a house at 33 Linden Street, which was across the tracks from the old house. And we moved. Now, this is Linden Street on January 20th, 2017, which was my birthday, among other things on that day. Some of you may know. Anyways, it was painted when my grandfather bought it. You can still see that it has beautiful bones for a house. This was an important move for us. At last, we had our own yard, a single-family house, pear trees, lawns, and best of all, a great athletic field just behind the property, the General Electric Employees Association field. Perhaps as importantly, the new house was within sight of the Donovan-Williams 3-decker. In fact, if it's literally around the corner, and if you stand on the front of Linden Street here, you can almost touch the Williams and Donovan houses and vice versa. What a triumph for Harry this new house must have been. A half-orphaned infant from Ireland was now a father of 9 and a householder. My father recalled the housewarming celebration when our family moved into our first non-rented home, Bill tells us. It was quite a time, Harry told Bill, and typical of West Lynn entertainments. Most of the participants were great storytellers, and some of them were talented musicians. Though the time was deep into the Prohibition years, the house fairly rocked with gaiety, much like Phil the Fiddler's Ball or the Irish Ball. Pa did not recall any whiskey flowing like buttermilk as in the old songs. It was pretty hard to come by in those thirsty days of Prohibition. But this did not prevent the plates from rocking. Rocking so hard, Pa said, that the clock bounced off the mantel shelf and produced a good-sized lump on Bill's 12-year-old head. Pa added, there was plenty of cake and sandwiches and ice cream, but none of that beer, wine, or whiskey that legend has it appeared at Steve O'Donnell's wake. I wonder, don't you? The rite of the wake, Bill continues, that ceremony enacted upon the death of any member of the Irish community, also called for a crowd to descend upon the home of the bereaved to help the widow through a difficult time. Note that Bill refers to a widow only. Apparently, very few widowers outlived their wives, perhaps due to the early deaths from work-related toxins suffered by so many men, including Harry Nolan himself. A steady stream of visitors filed through the Nolan home in the days following the death of my father back in 1930, Bill writes. The visitors came and stayed, filling almost every available room in the large house. They gossiped, they told stories about the deceased, about themselves, about the old country, and legendary figures of the past. The women gathered together, commiserating with Mary Ann about her loss, and telling her how fortunate she was to have so many fine children to give her solace. At the time of his father's premature death at age 57, perhaps from complications brought on by Morocco dressing toxins, Bill was 18 and had 2 siblings younger than himself still at home. Harry did leave the house on Linden Street to his family, however, even if he himself had only lived there for 6 years. Lynn had been founded in 1629 by the Massachusetts Bay Colony Puritans, and its Lynn Woods was the largest city park in America outside of New York's Central Park. It also enjoyed 10 miles of beach. Here's, by the way, this is an old postcard of part of Lynn Woods. It's Dungeon Rock Road in the center of it. If you walk down that road, you'll come to a huge rock with a cleft in the middle of it. And in the 17th century, pirates used to stash their loot there. It's very near the Saugus River, which is a saltwater estuary coming in from Lynn Harbor. And so it's got a mysterious and wonderful and authentic history to it. And this is from Kings Beach in Lynn, looking over to Red Rock in the foreground, and way out there in the horizon is the Sphinx. I always think of it as of Egg Rock. It looks further away than it really is in real life. You can see Nahart, where Uncle Pat O'Connor lived, on the horizon as well. So this is one of the views of the magnificent beachfront of Lynn, Massachusetts. So it has 10 miles of this with a mysterious egg rock on the Atlantic horizon, with a reservoir located in Lynn Woods, provided the city with its own drinking water, said to be among the purest sources of city water anywhere in urban America. By the late 19th century, Lynn was a thriving industrial city of over 110,000 and a mecca for immigrants seeking work like Mary Ann and Harry. Unlike North Brookfield and other mill towns that Massachusetts had pioneered, Lynn had an industrial economy based on shoemaking. It was also the birthplace of the General Electric Company. As a result, there was plenty of work, not only for skilled and unskilled factory labor, but also in the service industries like Mr. Spinney's laundry, as well as in the professions, like including teachers, needed to support such a large employed population. Lynn's downtown boasted 2 distinct main streets, Market and Union, both within blocks of the oceanfront, and each lined with thriving department stores and other retail outlets, and movie theaters and vaudeville theaters, and restaurants. And the city was dotted everywhere with well-designed playgrounds. So this is Central Square at the very foot of Market Street. If you were to walk following those cars past the building there, you would end up on the beach within, oh, I don't know, quarter of a mile at the most. And Union Street would have been perpendicular to Market Street, which we're seeing here. Lynn also had one of the more sophisticated public school systems in Massachusetts, a state that invented American public education in the early 19th century. Its schools included 3 high schools: trade for students seeking to enter the skilled trades after graduation, English for students seeking entrance into the clerical and accounting professions after graduation, and classical for students seeking preparation for college by studying Latin and Greek, among other intellectual offerings. Beneath the superstructure of high schools, created in an era when most Americans had no access to education beyond the 8th grade, were 4 junior high schools, one in each of the city's 4 geographical areas: Breed, Eastern, Pickering, and Cobbett. Beneath that layer, dozens of elementary schools dotted the city's neighborhoods. Few children needed to walk more than a block or 2 to get to school. The city's teachers held prestigious jobs and were looked up by their fellow citizens as the scholars they sometimes were. This is the Lynn Common, by the way. It's rumored to be shaped in this, as a sole of a shoe. I think it probably is, but I don't think that was intentional. But of course, it's very ironic. But the Lynn Common is still a beautiful place. And this is the Lynn Public Library. The main library, it's on North Common Street facing the Common. The main library facing the city's Common, near the equally majestic City Hall, was the hub for book-filled branches located throughout the cities. Throughout his school years, Bill remembers spending hours away from the crowded family home at the Houghton Street Branch Library in West Lynn. It was here that he read tales of daring do like Beau Geste, which was perhaps his favorite of all. A generation later, he regaled his primary school children with nightly retellings. He knew the stories by heart, and he knew exactly where to end each night's episode and declare it time for the lights out. Both children never forgot these bedtime dramas set on the Sahara. Their father, it seems, had inherited the Irish knack for keeping an audience enthralled and hungry for the next night's episode. Lynn was unique, Bill writes. Union brotherhood was in the atmosphere. There was a special tolerance among all ethnic groups within the city, bred by their joint problems, recreational outlets, identification of goals, and recognition of the causes for their low status. Apparently, he continues, Lynn's citizenry identified its class structure not by ethnic origin, religious identification, length of time in this new world, but by working conditions common to all, and a pride in the skill required to complete their roles. There was also a special tolerance for those who were less skilled. I guess the answer to why this harmony developed was pride in self, rather than a feeling of inferiority engendered by so-called superiors. Everybody in Lynn was practically on the same boat, and the enemy were the ones who sought to keep them there. Residents of Mill City sought to emulate the ones they considered their betters in attitudes, political affiliations, sometimes religion. Bill concludes, residents of mill towns like North Brookfield subordinated themselves to the power structure. In Lynn, workers formed their own self-sufficient world. As much as the fabled Skibbereen, the city shaped the Donovan-Nolan family's identity and values, and remained their true home, no matter how far each traveled away, both in distance and in economic circumstance in the course of their lives. And it still resonates with their children as well. This is, I think, one of the most remarkable signs I've seen in any American city. And it's on Lynn Shore Drive. It's facing the water. We've already been here. Red Rock is just over here on the, you can't quite see it, would be in the lower left. Egg Rock would be out on the horizon, and you can see these beautiful houses, which are still extant and still beautiful. And these houses once faced the water on their own private land. But in 1907, I think it's 1907, excuse me, no, it's 1903. If you can read this, 1903, the state of Massachusetts acquired, this is the word that's used on this sign, acquired the property that abutted the ocean front from private ownership. I don't know if they confiscated it by eminent domain or if they bought it, I don't know. But now you can see the title here, you walk where you could not walk before. I have taken this walk so many times since I moved north again in September. It's one of the most beautiful urban walkways I've ever been on. And no, I would not have been able to walk on it before 1903. It's really quite remarkable. I think even more remarkable is the fact that the city of Lynn decided to put this sign up on that walkway in modern times. It was not there when I was a teenager, for example, when I lived in Lynn. But it appears that the city of Lynn has not forgotten who it is and why it is, and why people like me and all of us can walk along the beachfront for almost 10 miles straight without stopping. Mary Ann and her sister Nellie plunged into the political and social life of their new hometown, son Bill writes. Neither was satisfied with domestic work, and Mary Ann especially became intensely involved in the ancient problems of her homeland and was active in raising funds for the cause of home rule in Ireland in her West Lynn neighborhood. She loved to tell the story of when Queen Victoria paid a visit to Cork and everyone was so concerned about her safety, daughter Helen remembered. All kinds of soldiers and guards were posted to handle the crowds. Despite this, no one showed up to see the Queen. Mary Ann would have been among the majority of those who chose to stay home that day. Like Annie Power in Gloucester, marveling at her tenant dressing up for the Queen's birthday, Mary Ann also chose to ignore the Victorian aura. Mary Ann met her husband at an Ancient Order of Hibernians dance, all of you should appreciate, held in West Lynn's Division 10 chapter. And I took this picture also on January 20th, 2017. The brick, of course, is new. It still has fellowship inside, trust me. And the little sign there probably is a copy of one that was there when Mary Ann and Harry met at one of those dances. Since Harry had arrived in Lynn as an infant, he could show the ropes to the pretty newcomer. The Hibernians were a good place to start. Also brought from Ireland to America earlier in the 19th century, the AOH, as it was known, had spread nationwide by the end of the century. It was both a political and social organization, and in cities like Lynn, it rivaled the church as a focal point for Irish American life. By the turn of the 20th century, it was a fervent voice for Irish independence, something that Mary Ann and Harry strongly endorsed. No longer satisfied with home rule, Mary Ann was a member of the Sinn Féiners, daughter Helen remembers, seeking full independence for an Irish republic. Even after her marriage, Bill adds, she spearheaded actions of this nature. Harry was no less ardent in the Irish cause. Son Bill remembers his father and his friends taking military drills outside Hibernian Hall on Saturday morning, and they took them very seriously. These men dreamed of returning to Ireland to take up arms against the British when the call came, although Harry never could. In the 1890s, beginning at the young age of 20, Mary Ann was elected president, charter president of the Ladies Auxiliary Ancient Order of Hibernians, Division 10, and she was re-elected several times, and eventually she held county and state board offices in this organization. This is the charter, and you can see this today in Division 10 in West Lynn that we just looked at, that building. They have a library. It's a very elegant little library, and this is the certificate. And then down at the bottom, you can see President Mary A. Donovan. And that is hanging there as of 2017. I'm sure it is still there. She represented Essex County and Massachusetts at national conventions and met many political notables in the process. Bill tells us her many offices in the county and statewide Hibernians speak rather vividly of her leadership abilities. I'm sure, he adds, her good looks and quick wits had equal billing in these achievements. Even Vice President Dawes was bemused by her. In fact, Bill remembered, Christmas and St. Patrick's Day birthday cards arrived at the house from President Coolidge's vice president, Charles G. Dawes, whom she met while on convention business in Washington. I imagine Mr. Dawes, was the president's emissary to the AOH convention of this important voting bloc. She was also a member of the Terence McSweeney Council of the American Association for the Recognition of the Irish Republic, which was named for the hunger strike victim who died in 1920 during Ireland's troubles. During the Irish War for Independence, between 1919 and 1921, Mary Ann went door to door in West Lynn, successfully urging her neighbors to buy Irish Republican war bonds. When neighbor John Quigley's father brought one, his wife questioned the sagacity of her husband's investing in bonds whose future redemption seemed an impossibility. In light of the many failed rebellions of the past, Bill tells us. If Mary Ann Nolan says these bonds are good, the senior Quigley retorted, then they are good, no matter what England or Ireland has to say about it, and let that be the end of it. In fact, eventually the bonds were all redeemed at face value and all dividends paid. Through this work, Mary Ann became acquainted with some of the lions of the Irish independence movement when they visited Massachusetts to drum up support and money for the cause, including Eamon de Valera, the Sinn Féin leader and later the legendary president of the Irish Republic. She also sat in the limousine at the front of the parade with Maud Gonne, the poet Yeats's muse and heroine of the cause of Irish independence, as it rode through the streets of Lynn during one of Gonne's campaign trips. Along the parade route, Bill tells us, one family member recalls that as the marchers passed the grand houses on Nahant and Ocean Streets, well, we saw that sign, you can walk here now where you never could before. Those are the houses we're talking about. In up from the beach, in front of those houses is Ocean and Nahant Streets. Some of the domestics were standing on the porches of these houses, waving green banners in anticipation of this great goal of the Irish in America. We are sure, and we have heard this from many sources, Bill continues, that the homeowners did not appreciate this display, and some of the girls were chided because of it. I just wonder sometimes if their grandchildren are the ones who erected that sign along King's Beach because of this particular cause célèbre back in the war in the 1920. By the time they became active in the Irish independence movement, Mary Ann and Harry had long been naturalized citizens of the United States. In fact, 2 years after their marriage, on October 17th, 1899, Harry was awarded American citizenship by the U.S. District Circuit Court in Boston. This document commemorating this landmark event proclaimed Harry James Nolan, a laborer from County Cork, Ireland, was now a citizen in the 124th independence of the United States. Married women's citizenship depended on their husbands getting citizenship, lasted until 1922. Mary Ann, of course, as a woman, could not vote in national election until women's suffrage was added to the United States Constitution in 1920. Nor would she have been able to vote, by the way, in Ireland until 1918. The now thoroughly American Nolans proliferated in Lynn. Altogether, Harry and Mary Ann were parents to 9 children, 6 boys and 3 girls. John Thomas, the little boy in the confirmation picture, born in 1898, a decade after Mary Ann had arrived in America and named after her father, was the first. And he was followed by 8 others. Harry James, born in 1900 and named for his father. James E., born in 1902 and named for Harry's father. Joseph F., born in 1905. Kathleen, born in 1908. Mary, born in 1910. William Francis, Bill, in 1912. He's the one in the suspenders here on the right. Edward Rowland, born in 1914. He's the shorter one, and that was always a point of contention between the 2 brothers, is the one on the left. Edward Rowland, born in 1914, and Helen Clare, born in 1916. Helen has been one of our informants throughout this paper. The boys, ironically, all carried names of English kings, even though they were actually named for family members and friends. Bill, in fact, was named after Lynn's St. St. Patrick Church's parish priest, William Francis Lyons, who had baptized him. I have a feeling that Mary Ann and Harry had simply run out of names by the time Bill came along. He was the seventh child. The two youngest sons, Eddie here and Bill, had a friendly competition throughout their lives. They were 2 years apart. As Bill once wrote to his daughter, Janet Ann, who would be me, he could still legitimately drive without glasses at age 70. But brother Eddie later outdid him. I just renewed my driver's license, Eddie wrote Bill. Passed the eye test without glasses at 75 yet. As the children grew older, each one in turn contributed to the economy of the family, a common practice in those days, Bill tells us. And Mary Ann was instrumental in seeing that each of her children was educated and employed productively. In 1916, eldest brother John, a graduate of Classical High School, enrolled at nearby Salem Normal School, bent on entering the teaching profession. But his goal of a college education was never realized, Bill writes, because the United States entered World War I in 1917, and John was drafted and transferred by the United States Army to the Student Army Training Corps at Tufts College in Medford for officer training. Although he never forgot his high school Latin and Greek, after the war, Bill writes, John went to work as an engineer draftsman at the Lynn plant of the General Electric Company, a place where many of the sons and daughters of the Lynn Irish community eventually found employment. While second oldest brother Harry never reached high school, Bill writes, he was a math whiz, and he too became an engineer at GE. The next in line, Jim and Joe, attended English high school, but they also left school to go to work. Joe followed his older brothers into the GE, but Jim broke with the pattern and became a reporter for the Lynn Transcript and the Lynn Daily Item, the city's largest newspapers instead. Eldest sister Kathleen graduated from English High School's commercial course in 1926 and immediately was hired as a bookkeeper at the Postar Company, furniture company on Broad Street in downtown Lynn. Her proud younger brother, Bill, wrote years later. This is Kathleen, and you can see she was a flapper in 1926 with her shingled marcelled hair. She was quite a woman. She later found a big job as a clerical job at GE. So she left Postar Furniture Company and went to much better paid job at GE. By the way, she is tragic. She was beloved by her brothers and sisters, but she was born in 1908, but she died from cancer in 1954, at the age of 46. So it's very sad. I remember her very vaguely. I only knew her for about a year because I did not grow up in Lynn in my earliest childhood, so I didn't get to know her well. Following in John's footsteps, Sister Mary graduated from Lynn Classical and enrolled in Salem Normal School. Classical High was still the elite school in Lynn during Mary's time there, Bill writes. Only students who were college-bound elected classical over the more practical Lynn English. Bill's turn was next. And after finishing the commercial course at Lynn English, was urged by both his mother and his teachers to take a postgraduate college prep course to prepare him for entering what was by then Salem Teachers College in 1931, the year Mary began her junior year. Youngest brother Eddie, who Mary Ann said was a dead ringer for her handsome father, John Donovan, graduated from Lynn Classical, which by his time had been converted from a college prep-only curriculum to a comprehensive curriculum, and the New England Aircraft School. According to his brother Bill, Eddie was a bright but indifferent student growing up, mischievous, but never malicious. Once, much to his writerly brother's delight, junior high schooler Eddie showed Bill a homework essay due the next day titled The Fly. The fly, Eddie wrote, walks around on its filthy fly feet. That was it. Despite his lack of literary enthusiasm, during his 40-year career, Eddie helped pioneer GE's manufacture of jet airplane engines in Lynn and Lancaster, California. He really was a rocket scientist. The youngest sibling, Helen, also enrolled in Salem Teachers College, entering her freshman year just as Bill entered his senior year. She too graduated and, like Mary and Bill, became a teacher in the Lynn public schools. In an era when few working class Americans went beyond the 8th grade, 5 of Mary Ann's children went on to higher education, becoming engineers and teachers, Bill writes. And altogether, 4 of Mary Ann's sons and 1 daughter worked in the General Electric Company. And let's not forget, 3 of them became teachers as well. While his children were succeeding at school and at work, Harry also found a way up and out of Morocco dressing as he rose through the ranks of the Lynn's Benz Kid Company on Boston Street, becoming a supervisor as well as a leading leather worker organizer for Lynn's cordwainers union. Forced out of Benz for his union work in one of Lynn's dozens of labor strikes. If you remember, my father mentioned that Lynn's workers were not docile. Harry took a job as a desk man for the GE at the start of World War I in 1917. Indeed, Harry had come a long way from the Morocco dressing at the tannery of his early career by the time of his death. Nevertheless, those early years among toxic chemicals most likely contributed to the chronic endocarditis, a bacterial disease affecting the heart valves that eventually caused his death, according to his death certificate. My father had collapsed when he struggled into our kitchen after battling his way home to Linden Street from the General Electric in a blizzard, Bill later wrote. He never fully recovered from that bout, dying 2 years later. Bill compared his father's ordeal to another blizzard 7 years later, when Bill also staggered home to that same kitchen. I was almost to my 23rd birthday on the night of my epic battle with the elements, he tells us. I am now 68. I think I'm in excellent shape for a man my age. Could I repeat my performance on that January night in 1935? His father had at age 55, surviving that test at least for a while. After her husband's death on May 2nd, 1930, Mary Ann's life went on, son Bill tells us, seeing her children move up and out into places of society, solid American citizens. She supervised their educations and watched them go to careers and marriages and raising families of their own, even though she did suffer deeply from the premature deaths of both daughters, Kathleen and Mary, in the 1950s. Daughter Helen adds, throughout her life, Irish lore never left her. She retained a deep love of Ireland, heaven on earth. I can see why, Helen continues. She had a pretty hard life, and her Irish childhood must have been a time of great peace for her. She always wanted to go back, and when we could afford to take her, she was too sick and unable to go. In 1960, on her deathbed in her Swampscott home across from Fisherman's Beach, the now 88-year-old Mary Ann looked out the window at the sea, claiming she could see all the way to Skibbereen, she once told Bill. Although she was blind by this time, she said she could see the Celtic black dog of death at the end of the lane, remembered from her childhood world. 30 years after her husband's death, son Bill writes, and some 20 years after the deaths of her brother and sister, and some 72 years after her arrival in this country, the dog had finally come for her in the form of bronchopneumonia, according to her death certificate. All of her surviving children were at her bedside when she drew her final breath on May 15th, 1960, Bill writes. After a funeral mass at St. John the Evangelist Church, a few blocks from her Humphrey Street home, she was buried beside her husband in St. Mary's Cemetery in Lynn. Like hundreds of thousands of other members of her sex who undertook the great adventure of coming to America, she found what she was seeking in the New World, success and fulfillment for her children. Her 7th son, Bill, concludes. So there is the saga of what happened when Harry met Mary Ann. I'd like my audience to think just a moment or two about the role of Lynn, the infrastructure of Lynn in enabling families like Mary Ann and Harry's to get ahead. I think that's a very big story that I've only barely touched on in this paper, but one that intrigues me, and I'll leave it at that.
Janet, thank you so very much. We have a couple questions via chat, which I will relay to you in a moment. My takeaway from this is that your story is scalable and transportable to nearly every city in New England, one form or another. I was thinking of Providence with the Irish, Brown and Sharp. Lynn had General Electric, which was a magnet for the town's labor force. Worcester had Wyman, Gordon, and Norton. In Connecticut, you had Pratt and Whitney, United Technologies, that it was another magnet for the Irish that lived in those communities. So truly fascinating. And Cormac O'Malley wrote great story, a real American story, with a question. Do you know if Ernie O'Malley ever visited your parents' home when he visited Lynn in 1928?
Wow, I have never heard that he had, but I bet they saw him, at least from afar. Harry would still have been alive too. I can't imagine that if he were in Lynn, they would not have made the effort to go say hello to him in some way or another. But being in their home, I doubt it. Someone would have told me by now, I think. That would have been a big deal. And tell Cormac that he has a family story.
Oh, yes, he does. And someone by Kathy, and I don't know who Kathy is, wrote what a wonderful, really enjoyed the GE story. And she wrote also like Norton's in Worcester, where half of the city ended up working for a particular company and raised them into the middle class.
Yes, exactly. Right. Yeah.
From Linda writes, what percentage Irish is Lynn today? Do you have a feel for that?
I don't know. That's a wonderful question. It was always a slight majority, certainly in Harry and Mary Ann's time, but never a vast majority, because Lynn is so multi-ethnic. It always has been multi-ethnic. Large numbers of Greeks, Italians, you name it. Black African Americans. It was an industrial city. There was room for everyone. There was, as my father points out, there was very little ethnic or racial rivalry in the city. They were workers united in their consciousness, I guess. But today, I know the demographics of Lynn have changed in the last 50 or 60 years since I last lived there. And I'm going to guess there are many more Hispanics today than there are Irish. I don't know that for a fact. But still, one of the things I've noticed as returning to this part of the world after so many years away, how many Irish are still there, and how many trucks go by with Irish names on them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the Irish presence in Lynn is still very strong. I would be shocked if it weren't.
And we have another statement and a question. Your Irish family story is typical of the Irish immigrants with chain migration to cities like Lynn. Did the Irish enclave move out of the Irish neighborhoods when they became educated with new occupations?
Oh, most definitely. All of my uncles and aunts moved to beautiful middle-class homes. So they all succeeded. I mean, the remarkable part, I think, is the fact that Mary Ann and Harry were able to get them, so many of them, into college, and certainly through high school in those days, where earning, each child had to support the family after Harry died. And so each brother had to stay at home. Each daughter stayed. Helen stayed with her mother until her mother's death. And within a year, she married and moved to Florida and lived happily ever after. But all of them got up and out in the sense that they were no longer in working class West Lynn, with the exception of Joe. I think he was the fourth son. We always thought of him as the most Irish of all of our uncles and aunts. And he stayed in West Lynn. He married a woman from County Mayo and lived happily ever after.
A beautiful county, Mayo.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a great one from Ted, and I think Ted and Donna. Donna writes, they're board members of the museum. Ted was born in Lynn as well as his mother.
Huh.
Our lives were similar, but we are Polish. Everyone worked at GE.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good one.
That was the place to go. It was like Willie Sutton and Banks. That's where the money was. And also, those were good jobs. That shoemaking, those tanneries killed people, literally poisoned them. And GE was clean work. And intellectual work, skilled labor. It was infinitely a boon to city of Lynn to have GE settle there. No question about it.
From Kathy Gallagher, what really strikes me is the number of high schools, junior high schools, and elementary schools, plus the GE plant in Lynn. I think that was common in those days. Yep.
The educational system was excellent. Both of my parents were teachers in the Lynn Public Schools, and I'm a product of the Lynn Public Schools, at least partially. And I mean, I had teachers in high school who had Amherst degrees, Harvard degrees, Radcliffe degrees. I mean, you know, the Depression forced people of great privilege to actually teach in those Lynn schools. The buildings are still intact and they're still beautiful. I went back to my high school. It was built in 1930, so it's 90 years old now. It's stunning. We had a little theater all beautifully paneled in wood, and then a big theater too, and a thriving theater department when I was a kid at that high school, just for instance. So the infrastructure, the willingness to put money into public services and public goods for the good of all really strikes me as being something very strong in Lynn and something very admirable about that city.
And a similar one here. This is from, and the name is McCalnan to everyone. We are from Lynn, and we are from the AOH Ladies Division. So you have a tasker here now. Fascinating presentation. Did you grow up and go to high school in Lynn? I think you answered that. Where do you live now? Would love you to visit the division and present this presentation.
Well, that's a deal. I will do that in a split second. So perhaps we can get my email address to this person, because I would love to do that. That would be very meaningful for me to do in honor of my grandmother and grandfather. So that's for sure. And then I forget what the other part of the question was now, but the AOH in Lynn is thriving. I mean, I had never been there until January 20th, 2017. And I went with a high school friend of mine from Lynn English. And we walked in because her husband was a very important member of the AOH on the North Shore of Boston too. And his picture is in that library, in the Division 10 library, and as his Mary Ann certificate. And I can remember that certificate with Mary Ann's signature on it, copies of it being given to all the brothers and sisters when I was growing up, all her children. They were very, very proud of their mother. She had 9 children, but that did not keep her at home. She did interesting things with her life, given that she had no money, and she had 9 children whom she raised very successfully, and she was quite remarkable.
Do you know whether, is that AOH the same building that was there in the 1890s when they met?
Again, I don't. That's something I need. That's why I'd love to meet this person who's active in it now, because it probably isn't. But I don't know. I again am not really a product of Lynn. I was just a carpetbagger. I lived there from the ages of 9 to 17 only. But it isn't like I don't know the place, because I lived there in those formative years where I walked every square block of the place, but
Sure.
Every bus. But I never knew much about the AOH until I started looking back at it in the history of Irish in America. And then I started getting very interested in it. So I would like to talk to somebody who knows a lot more about it than I do.
No apology. I didn't know about the AOH till I moved to Newport. Here's one from Stephen Bader to everyone. My mother was born in Lynn and grew up in Malden.
Mm-hmm.
I met her grandmother once in Lynn when I was less than 10 years old. It sounds like she would have been one of Mary Ann's peers. Thank you so much for the presentation. Here's one from Catherine Murray. Thank you for reminding me of precious stories about my great-grandparents, both maternal and paternal, who emigrated from Ireland in the 1870s.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful Irish ancestral details about what our ancestors experienced. So you can see people are really getting into this.
And this is, I'm so glad to hear this to all of you who could recognize your own stories in this, because I think it is the story, isn't it? Mary Ann and Harry are examples of the story. Especially in the Northeast in the 19th and early 20th centuries of we Irish.
And a couple of us chatting said, you know, we haven't been to Lynn in a while. This is an impetus to go back.
Good.
Take a look.
I love Lynn. I am so, and having come back to it, I left it over 50 years ago. And I have revisited it periodically. I've lived all over the country since then, but you know, it never stopped grabbing me. I mean, it's just a wonderful city. I'd like to see it revived. I'd like to see it cleaned up a little, but it still has all that infrastructure is still there.
In the spirit, yeah.
And it wouldn't take much. It wouldn't take much at all. So anyone interested in getting a Lynn improvement thing going, I'll join.
And here's one in closing, I think, unless, oh, we have a few more now. This is great. One of the comment, this was just grand. Thank you so much from Maureen Whitley. This is from John G, who sends love from Portsmouth. Loved your talk and mention of County Mayo. And it looks like there may have been more on here, but it's now deleted. From John Murphy to everyone, a beautiful tale with the pride of Janet Nolan and her ancestors being well-deserved. As a descendant of Michael Bean and Annie Nicholson, who came to Newport as servants, I feel the same way. Of their 8 children, 2 went to college. My mother, Mary Catherine Bean, went to Rice and became a teacher. Her brother, Austin Carty Bean, went to the U.S. Naval Academy and became executive officer of Pensacola in World War II. He won the Silver Star at Guadalcanal and unfortunately was killed with 17 shipmates at Iwo Jima.
Oh.
From Anne La Montagne to everyone, Milford also had a large Irish population. And our church, St. Mary's, still has a rather large Irish population. Victoria Johnson to everyone. Thank you. Family histories are so important. I hope all of our histories are given to our children and passed on. Years from now, yours will be sealed. Well done. From Ann Arnold, if anyone would like to reach Dr. Nolan, please send a note to the Irish Museum. We will be sure to connect you, and we will. From Jill Sussery, dialing in from Swampscott, about 5 minutes from Fisherman's. Loved your talk. Sad that Lynn has hit a hard patch after such a marvelous egalitarian past, as so many cities in New England have.
Yes.
From Pat McGew, thank you for a lovely presentation. Many similarities to my grandparents' experience. All 4 came from the west of Ireland in the 1910s and settled in New York City. We were all raised to be very proud of our Irish heritage. But interestingly, my grandparents almost never talked about their childhood in the old country.
Yeah.
I think common.
Very common.
I guess perhaps because life was pretty hard in the late 1800s. When they were growing up, they came here because they had to.
That's right.
Not because they wanted to. Well said. And that concludes the questions. Okay, we're going to open it up and take a look at the screens. And if you have a question, raise your hand, please.
Hello, Mike.
I can see a few people out there. If those few people have questions, raise your hand.
I think people can turn off and only makes them ask a question. Beautiful houses I'm looking at here.
I grew up going to Lynn Beach.
Yeah.
Janet, I grew up going to Lynn Beach. I was in Dorchester. I moved to Wakefield, but we went to, my whole high school years were spent at Lynn Beach.
Yes. We took it for granted when we were in high school. It's the
Oh,
most
yeah, it
magnificent beach.
Yeah, you just went to we drove to it was great. So I have very fond memories of
I
Lynn.
can remember, before I turned 16, not having access to a car, and we would just I lived up near Lynn Woods and almost in Lynnfield, and we would get on one bus and we'd change and we'd get down to Central Square. And my mother used to give me a quarter, 10 cents each way on the bus, and 5 cents for a Coke at Stiliano's, a little Italian restaurant underneath the tracks in Central Square. And then my friend Patty McCauley and I would walk down to the beach. And then we'd walk back, take the bus back, 25-cent afternoon.
We made friends with people who could drive. So,
Yeah, oh, well, we got wheels. It was, a whole new world, but
great.
that is a beautiful beach. January is wonderful this year because we didn't get much snow, so that the sidewalks are beautifully kept.
Nice.
They really do shovel them and they're perfectly paved. And I could walk there almost every morning for the whole month of January. Now, it was cold, but not awfully cold if you bundled up. I used to live in Chicago, so that's why I can do these things. But anyways, I just could never get tired of it.
No.
This is the most beautiful, invigorating, life-enhancing walk I know of.
It was great.
So I urge you all, if you haven't been to Lynn Beach, easy to park there, easy to get there, and it is worth.
Yes, it is.
Janet, that was Tom and Mary Kager, who now live in New York, but were very active, in not only the museum, but
You all.
Hibernians as well.
Well,
Yeah,
hello.
good to see you. Yes.
You're in New York now, then.
Any other questions from the audience? I think that's it. I think we're gonna. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you very much, Janet.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
And we'll look forward to getting back with you at the next venue to be announced.
Okay.
Yeah, bye.
Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.
Irish.
Peace.